In 1979, General Motors sent one of its designers, Gordon Brown, he was more affectionately known as Gordy, to Opel to lead their design team. At the time, General Motors had just launched the new T-car in Europe, or at least the front-wheel drive T-car. That car really stayed in Europe, although I do believe it was sold in South Africa and a couple of other markets as well, but it was nowhere near as global as the previous rear-wheel drive T-car, Chevette, etc. That was going to change with the second generation front-wheel drive T-car, which was this. Gordy's mission was to basically head the design of this car, and that he did, and work started in late 1979. The Opel Kadett E, or Vauxhall Astra E as it was known in Britain, debuted in 1984 with a variety of engines from GM's relatively new Family 1 and Family 2 units. Those engines actually began life as a derivative of one of GM Brazil's engines that it designed late on in its Chevette. It was always GM's plan for the Astra E to be marketed globally. The Opel version alone was sold as a Chevy in some markets in South America. But it had always had its eyes on the North American market, and for that it needed to get the car produced cheaply. So it eyed a manufacturer in South Korea, which was at the time relatively unknown for anything other than televisions and plant equipment. That manufacturer was Daewoo, and Daewoo began production under license from Opel of this car in 1986. The South Korean car, would not only be marketed in its home market, but also in certain markets like Malta, for instance, and New Zealand, and the United States and Canada. The North American versions were badged Pontiac in the United States and as Passport in Canada. Passport was a dealer franchise which was directly owned by General Motors. That was fairly short-lived, and the Canadian version went under several different monikers during its time there. But I'm going to concentrate on the American version, which obviously is this. It's the Pontiac LeMans. It was basically a rebadge of the Daewoo LeMans in its home market. Now, you might think it looks identical to the Astra and Kadett, but there are quite a few differences. First off, for North America, with the engines, which we'll talk about in a minute. But as time went on, GM developed and re-engineered most of the parts for this car. So by the time we get to 1990, which this model is, there's a lot that's different, a hell of a lot technically that's different about the car, from the brakes to the fuel tank. This is actually my Le Mans. I picked it up a couple of years ago. I found it under a tree. It didn't run. We've got it running. When we're driving the car, I'm going to tell you what we've had done to the car, because there's a lot of money that's been spent on this thing, and it is still very much a work in progress. It's absolutely filthy after its winter slumber, but it seems to be running okay. So as we're driving, we'll talk more about it. I'm Darren Walker, and this is Auto Atlantica. So as I've said, at first glance this looks almost identical to a Kadett and Astra, apart from some obvious differences for North America, like the bumpers, for instance, and the badging. There was 3 models essentially for the US market in 2 body styles. The 3-door hatchback, and also the 4-door sedan, which was marketed, of course, as the Belmont in the UK. The 5-door hatchback, which Daewoo did produce in South Korea, never made it to North America. And that 5-door hatchback was distinctly different from the Opel version because it did not share the rear doors with the Opel. It used the doors from the sedan, i.e. the Belmont, and then it had an extra C-pillar window on the side. But there's a lot of differences between this car and the Astra, especially by the time you get to 1990 like this one is. Obviously this one's got air conditioning. Air conditioning came with the power steering package. It's also got the smog equipment, which was unique to North America, and the brakes are completely different. The fuel system's very different, even the fuel sender is different. There were 3 models in the United States. The base trim, which used a version of the Family 1 engine, the L73, which was 1.6 developing about 75 horsepower. There was the LE, which was a bit more upmarket. That's this one. And you got sort of nicer fabric seats, rev counter, etc. And you could also opt for air conditioning in the LE, which this one has. That used the same engine, the same 1.6. And then there was the all singing, all dancing GSE version, which basically looked quite similar to the Opel Kadett GSI and Vauxhall Astra GTE, but it was saddled with a 95 horsepower engine, the C20LZ I think it was. That was actually built in Australia. So there was no twin cam units at all for North America. Even though the GSE looked the part, it certainly didn't act the part. But that said, the North American ones are quite sprightly, and this one, after all these years, still drives actually really well. Okay, if you notice some red lights on the dashboard, I don't know if you'll be able to see them from there. One is for the seat belt. This is a lap belt, so I just keep that over me like that because the automatic seat belts, which were mandated for 1990 because this did not have an airbag, so it had to have one of these things instead, doesn't work. In fact, it's only worked once since I've had the car, and that's fairly typical for them. The one in my Jaguar has never worked, and that's the same model year. But also the lap belt, because it's not plugged in properly and this isn't operating, will flash with another red light on the dashboard several times while we're driving, so I just ignore it. So basically the only differences between this and the Kadett and Astra are there's no analog clock here, it just says Le Mans, because the clock was digital in these, because the American radios are set to different points on the FM scale than in Europe. It's a specific radio for North America, and this one's made by Delco. The clock was actually part of the display. On this particular car, it's a bit worn and the display no longer works, so I have managed to source a new old stock one, brand new old stock one actually. So just go for a drive and I'll tell you what we've had done to it. So I found this car languishing under a tree. It was practically a barn find. It was filthy, there was a ton of tools in there, the seats were covered in swarf, you didn't even want to sit in it. The first thing I did was put new tyres all around on it because they were flat, and I also sourced some wheel trims. These are the proper wheel trims for it to spruce it up a bit. It then had a new fuel pump in it because that was the problem, it wasn't working. And after that, it just had an oil change. So we had it running. That fuel pump kind of clapped out after a couple of months. And so last year I had an extensive amount of work done to this car. We started off with the fuel system with the tank cleaned out. There was new tank straps on it, new fuel sender, which was actually Daewoo specific. It's not compatible with the Opel whatsoever. And we had new fuel lines manufactured, and we had new fuel filters as well. So all the fuel system is practically new. The ignition system, new distributor went in. We also had new HT leads, new spark plugs as well. And then for the brakes, we had all new brake lines manufactured too, and drums on the back and pads, and new pads on the front along with new discs. Now again, the discs were Daewoo specific, so I went with some aftermarket Brembo ones just to treat the car a little bit, and so the brakes now work perfectly because they were just really dodgy. Power steering, put a new power steering pump on it because that wasn't working properly, and new power steering lines as well, so that's new. With the power steering package, you had air conditioning that came with the power steering package on this car. I think they used the same belt, so the air conditioning seems to be working now for the first time since I've had the car as well. The rest of it's going to be cosmetic. It does have some rust issues on both of the bottom of the front fenders. That's going to need cut out and probably a plate put on each side. Around the high level brake light, which is actually built into the tailgate, that needs doing. Also on the tailgate, it needs a new weather strip around the window. And then it's just the interior. I'm going to go over these seats with upholstery cleaner again because they need it. Despite how this looks, I've already cleaned this up tremendously, and it's come up quite nicely, but it does need going over again, needs to be vacuumed again. Then the passenger door card. Daewoo was not renowned for building these cars well, and the parts were quite cheap, and the materials were cheap that it used. This door card is falling away. I can salvage that and just get that glued back on, but this headliner is completely shot. It's got holes in it, and it's just cheap and nasty, and I'm going to have a custom, more luxurious headliner put in it because again, I think the car deserves it. But I'll get it in this grey colour which matches the seats and the rest of the upholstery. There's not a huge amount to do to it. Once I've done that, I do intend showing the car. One of the biggest issues with this car was the marketing, because it was called a Le Mans, and that really upset a lot of Pontiac enthusiasts because the Le Mans was a fabled muscle car back in the day, and then the name was really diluted for this very cheap throwaway little hatchback. But that's one of the reasons why I like it. Those little quirks of marketing in automotive history really appeal to me, and that's another reason why I bought this thing. Apart from the fact that these are now extremely rare. The guy that sold it to me, he didn't have an awful lot of money, and he had other vehicles on his plate, and I think he wanted like $800 for it, and we eventually came to a mutually agreeable price of $625, which was a bit more than what I wanted to pay, but I was never going to find another one. So I've spent over $3,000 on this car since I bought it, so that's money that I'm unlikely to ever see back. But you know, that's why we save these things. You don't save them as an investment. This car will never be an investment. You never know, I might get it. If I get it up to near Concours condition, which is going to require a lot of work, I might get that money back, but I don't intend selling it. It has been spluttering a bit today, especially at idle. I think it might be the fuel that's old, so I'm going to spend the day messing around in this car, give it a few good runs because it certainly needs it. It needed it last year but when we got the work done at the end of October, the car pretty much went straight away into the car barn for the winter. So that's it from me. I hope you've enjoyed this little insight into my 1990 Pontiac LeMans. As dirty as it is, God, it really does need a clean. But it's a survivor, and that's the main point of buying cars like this. Remember, in the US, these were throwaway cars. They weren't even family cars. And that's why they were built cheap to a price to begin with. These were often used by students, for instance. The vast majority have gone, and finding another one is really hard. In the last 10 years, I found one that was actually near concours condition. The others that I've come across, only about 3 or 4, have all been pretty much non-runners. But this one was worth saving. There's still a fair amount cosmetically that needs to be done, but you know, Rome wasn't built in a day. I'm Darren Walker, and this is Auto Atlantica.